The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation presents Our Story, hosted by the Foundation's chairman and president, Jason Villalba. Each week on Our Story, hear the personal and intimate stories of Hispanics all across Texas, told in their own voices. Our Story provides insight into a community of people who are literally and figuratively changing the complexion of the United States. This is who we are.
Welcome to the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation's podcast called Our Story. Today we have a very special guest with us. It's Poncho Nevarez, one of my dearest friends from the Texas Legislature. His story, I think, is both inspirational and really quite fascinating. So I'm anxious to hear from him. We're going to introduce him in a moment. But first, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping details. The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation, you can find us online at txhpf.org, and you can find us on Twitter at TXHPF. I'm Jason Villalba. I'm the president and chairman, and this is Our Story. Poncho, welcome.
Jason, welcome, man. I'm welcoming you to your podcast. Hey, before we get started, man, I want to congratulate you and the foundation for having one of the most, if not the most accurate polls on this last election, in particular with respect to Hispanics and Latinos in the state of Texas. I mean, it was almost perfect.
Well, thank you. We put a lot of time and effort into that. Our friends at Rice University and the Baker Institute, I did an amazing job. Mark Jones, our chief of analytics, is probably one of the best in the state. You and I know him well from our time in the legislature, and he is just a real thought leader on these kinds of issues and was helpful to build that.
I got a bone to pick with him on one of my rankings.
I do too for my last election. Poncho, you're one of the people that I really wanted to reach out to initially, just because not only our closeness as friends during the time in the legislature, we're classmates, we came in together, but I just think that your story is fascinating. And more importantly, you ride a kick-ass Harley Davidson. And so that was pretty cool. And you fly airplane, you play guitar, you're in a rock band and all these things. So I really found you to be an interesting person. And so I'm glad that you're here. I'm thankful that you'd be a part of this today. And I just want to start from the very beginning. The mission of this show is to hear from you. What is it about you that makes you Poncho Nevarez? What shaped you? Let's start in the beginning. Tell me a little bit about growing up in West Texas and Eagle Pass. Tell me about your parents. Tell me about your grandparents.
I grew up in and around Eagle Pass, Texas, which is right on the Texas-Mexico border. It's about 2 hours southwest of San Antonio. And I tell people Latin America begins in downtown San Antonio, and it stretches south and west down to Eagle Pass, and then south and east to Corpus, and then all the way down. You know, I had a unique childhood in that I spent a lot of time shuttling back and forth from the Mexican side to the U.S. side. I went to parochial school on the U.S. side. I went to high school on the U.S. side, and my dad was the postmaster in Eagle Pass, which is kind of odd because we'd spend a lot of time in Mexico, and I don't know if you can do that anymore, but we did growing up. And I've got two sisters, one that's passed away about 3 years ago, it'll be 4 years this October, and I've got a younger sister who works with me today, and I've got a wife, I've got 3 kids, I've got 4 dogs, and I live on a ranch right on the Rio Grande, and I tell people if I wind my arm up and warm it up enough, I can throw a rock and hit Mexico on some days. So
growing up, did you spend a lot of time with grandparents or grandparents in the States, or were they back in Mexico?
They were in Mexico. And, my grandmother and grandfather lived in a small town outside of Piedras Negras, Coahuila, which is the town on the Mexican side. And my grandfather had a ranch out there, and he passed away when I was quite small. And so my grandmother was alone, and my mother was an only child. And so I spent a lot of time over there. I spent a lot of time with them. My oldest sister at the time, she was sick. And so my parents spent a lot of time coming back and forth between Houston because she was being treated at the time by Denton Cooley, who was one of the best heart surgeons in the world, if not the best heart surgeon in the world. And we were very fortunate for that at the time. But what it occasioned was, for different reasons, me having to spend a lot of time with my grandmother. And I think that it shaped a lot of how I perceived the world because I was seeing it from a different point of view than a lot of my classmates just from being in Mexico, right?
Tell me about her.
You know what? My grandmother is from a long line of, her last name's Castillon, as my mother's is as well, and it's mine as well. They came from southern Spain, and they were some of the first settlers to come through with the Canary Islanders, and then they stayed in Guerrero. Guerrero's an old mission town, and from there, all the exploration voyages, if you will, into what they call La Tierra Incognita, which was Texas. They all started there. In fact, any mission that was founded in Texas and Louisiana, it was launched from this point. And so they came with the first settlers, and they were there. And so we've kind of been straddling that border since before it was a border.
Tell me a memory that you have as a boy with your grandmother.
I remember my grandmother, this is a good one. In fact, I was talking to her about the other day, because I still, in my mind, it's one of those things that's indelible, is we were out in the yard, and, we had the ranch, and then she lived in town, and in town she had about 4 acres that she lived on. And I was in the backyard, and this pretty big snake comes out, and I must have been about 10 or 11. And, I'm like Indiana Jones. I hate snakes. And so I said, my grandmother was like nothing. She just went up there, like grabbed a hoe, I think, and just whacked that snake to death. And I remember watching my grandmother whack the snake to death, thinking, man, she's awesome.
It's funny. Latinos all across the state have stories about strong women in their lives. It sounds like you come from the line of strong women. Tell me about your mother as well.
It's funny, because my mother my mother did not graduate from college. And one of the reasons she didn't is because she started to have kids, myself and my sister. And she just said, I didn't have time. You all were my time now. But she's extremely well-read, very intelligent. She has a lot of opinions about a lot of things. I think she formed, and was the basis and is the basis for a lot of how I view the world politically, if you will. To this day, she wrote me a letter. I was in rehab, and she wrote me a letter, not necessarily about me being in rehab, but about some complaints that she had. And since I'm her state representative, it was regarding water. And I had to send her a letter telling her, well, I'm not really in charge of the water system in Eagle Pass, but I'll find out what's going on. This is when I came back. But it just kind of underscored the type of person that she is. And she sent me another letter too. And I was rereading it the other day. I was putting away some correspondence that I had, and it was another letter that she sent to me while I was in the rehabilitation center. And it was, she was tracking the impeachment hearings. She mentioned how it was going. And then she said in the letter that she was very impressed with Texas's Sylvia Garcia, because she was one of the House managers of the impeachment proceedings. And so she made note of that. And I need to tell Sylvia about that, because my mom took pains to give her some credit in that letter.
Well, your grandparents, are your parents politically active?
My grandmother was on the Mexican side. We were Priistas, which is, it's the main party, if you think about it. And so we got involved in a lot of the, I would see my grandmother get involved in a lot of the local races for alcalde, presidente municipal, which is sort of the mayoral post, if you will. And so those were always topics of discussion. Even now, there's almost as much talk about politics in Mexico at my house as there is politics in the U.S.
Did you catch the bug early, the political bug early, or was that something that came at a later time?
I didn't really have a concept or the idea of being politically active other than knowing what was going on. And I can't say that I thought of myself as being a candidate for X, Y, or Z, but I was always in the mix of things. I just seemed to be, I had a knack for kind of finding my way to the front. And there's probably a lot of different reasons for that. One is that was kind of my mother's way. The other is, I was smaller growing up. And so that, just kind of forced me to be more precocious, more, in some cases more violent, just from a standpoint of, you don't want to be bullied. And so it causes you to kind of bow up a little more than maybe you should. And some of that, it's never left me. But that was kind of the start of that.
So a lot of people that have some of that tendency, I know myself included, learn some of that on the sports fields. Was sports a big part of growing up? Or
yeah, I was, I played baseball, I played football, I ran track. I was engaged, whether it was in the street, that the neighborhood that I grew up in on the U.S. side was very competitive. There was a lot of guys my age, they're still friends to this day, and a lot of competing was done there, on those fields outside the house, and then later on, in more structured environments at school or with clubs. But athletics and sports was a big part. It still is, and I remember this last football season, I was with my dad at a practice. We were watching my son, and I have to resist the urge to want to coach him about X, Y, and Z, because for a football coach, I'm a pretty good lawyer or something else, right? But I made a comment about, he needs to be doing this, and that. And my dad looks at me, he's like, well, you weren't doing that at his age. And so it puts things in perspective. But the fact is a lot of what I later used in my professional and or political life, I learned it on a field,
So along with sports, church?
Yeah, that's a big deal. We would go to mass every Sunday or Saturday, depending on the circumstances. My parents are very devout, and I went to Catholic school, and part of it, I rebelled a lot from organized religion at some point because it seemed tedious to me. I've become, and I won't say I'm a better Catholic today than I was, I think, in the throes of my alcoholism and addiction, I wanted something to hang on to it. And maybe I wasn't doing it enough, but I think I incorporate a lot more spirituality in my life today as opposed to organized religion. But yeah, church was a big part of our lives.
There's a big movement really across Texas with Latinos, and it's the evangelical movement. You grew up Catholic. Most people in the region are probably Catholic. What do you believe is the driver behind the movement towards evangelical Christianity? What is driving that?
I think there's probably a couple of things, but one I see, I was surprised to learn that, some of my biggest supporters as I made my way through the legislature, in particular in Maverick County, there's what would pass for a mega church, if you will, in Maverick County. And it's a non-denominational Christian evangelical church, and it's got on its own, even though the Catholic diocese has more churches and more congregants, this church by itself is the largest church, if you will. And the pastor is a friend of mine and a good guy. And you could see, one is Hispanics tend to be devout, whether it's evangelicalism, which has caught on in a lot of Latin America, or Catholicism, which is always, it's the old religion, if you will, the old world religion that's always been there. Mexico is one of the largest Catholic countries in the world. I don't know if you caught this, but the other day in Argentina, they legalized abortion, which was a big deal based on the fact that Argentina is a pretty large Catholic country. And so I think people's desire to belong to things, people's desire to continue to incorporate religion in whatever form it might be, it spread from not just Mexico itself, but along the border and then further up for Hispanics that live further and further away from the border.
I wonder if it's changing the politics of the region. As you know, during the most recent election cycle, we saw some movement, and some people have attributed that to the evangelical movement. What do you think about it?
I think you're right. And I saw it because, I call him a kid because he's 20 years old. He's a young man that ran the Republican Party in Maverick County. I think now he's going to be working for Congressman Tony Gonzalez. He made a concerted effort this last time and I don't want to use the word infiltrate because it just gives it a negative connotation, but he did some work with the churches and it showed. And so, that appeal to vote for a Republican and or a Republican like Trump because of an issue like abortion, which, you can argue the back and forth about how nonsensical it would be to be a one issue voter on that, considering, all the other non-Christian things that you could argue a man like Trump is responsible for. But in fact, we saw that this last election. It can't be that the gains themselves are just attributed to some sort of economic solution or answer to a question. For instance, we saw a lot of people that were involved in the oil and gas business that said, well, they were being scared by a lot of oil and gas employers. Look, if Biden wins, there'll be no more oil and gas exploration, which we know that's not true. But it appealed to people. And you put that together with people that are moving a little closer to the church, a lot of these community groups that work within, whether it's a Catholic church or these non-denominational churches, it struck a chord. It's there.
What made you a Democrat?
One is the Republican Party is almost non-existent in.
So growing up, there was no Republican Party
No.
where you're from.
No, I mean, and you know what? The fact is, think about this, and it seems somewhat counterintuitive, but a lot of these counties, the fact that the Republican Party made gains because Democrats have been the only game in town, they're not that organized because they didn't have to be. You know, think about that. If you step on the field all the time and the other team's not there, well, how often do you have to practice?
Right.
How often do you have to stretch, if you will? And the answer to that is not much, and it showed. And so I remember going to college. There was an inflection point where you start seeing, you start opening your eyes to all these different points of view. And there's no doubt that my eyes were opened up to more mainstream conservative politics to a certain extent. And I realized that even though I could identify as a Democrat, I was a lot more conservative than, say, the Democrats that I saw on campus at the University of Texas. Does that make sense?
And that's not unusual, right, for you, the region that you come from. The Democrats that I worked with in the legislature, you included in Terry Canadas and others, Oscar Longorio, were more conservative Democrats. Is that because of the region? What drives that?
I think it's that there's a shared experience. And I would tell people that the next time we elect a Democrat speaker, it's going to be Hispanic, and it's going to be Hispanic from the border. And I would even tell you that it might exclude maybe, and I've got dear friends in the El Paso delegation, but I think they're more liberal than Democrats, say, from my district all the way to Brownsville. And so you would look at a pool of Democrats, whether it's an Eddie Lucio, an Oscar Longoria, a Richard Raymond, and I say Tracy King, even though he's not Hispanic, but he is to me. He was my state rep before I became the state rep. But I think that, and the reason I say that is, let's assume Democrats had taken the House this last session. The person that would have been the speaker would have been somebody that could roll in with 20 to 30 Republican votes in their back pocket before they needed to even appeal to the Democratic caucus.
Right.
And the ones that you could see were able to do that would be somebody like Armando Martinez or Oscar Longoria or Eddie Lucio, because they can appeal to Republicans that would have to explain that vote back in their districts. Well, I voted for these guys because they're more conservative. There's good leadership in these urban counties, but if you're looking at how to get elected, that's the route, I would believe.
Let's fast forward to college and law school. So you leave Eagle Pass, you go up to UT. You're probably one of the few Latinos on campus at that time that is, well, this is probably going to be what, the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
Were you a fish out of water? Was it different?
Yeah, I mean, I came from a small town. We were a big high school. We were 5A, but nothing could prepare you for, the culture shock of being on campus with 40,000 plus students and, major university with a big time football program that, you had football games every Saturday, which was awesome. And, I grew up watching that on TV and I was shocked at how little I knew about other people because, I tell people laughingly, like, in my part of the world, the gringos are just as Mexican as we are. And so I had no concept of the world. I mean, I had no black friends growing up. Think about that.
Right.
Because there weren't very many blacks, if any, in fact, I think, and they had already graduated before me, the children of some people that worked at Customs and Border Protection at the time. And so this was an assimilation into a different Texas that I didn't know. I came from a place where the inmates ran the asylum. And so, my cousin, who's a couple years older than me, he ended up working for George Bush for 43. And he worked for him in the governor's mansion and then went to the White House with him. And I remember a few times I would talk to him because he was at UT ahead of me, just seeing kind of the transformation that he was having in terms of a person that was now. And now when I look back, I don't think it was that much of a stretch based on how we grew up because we were that conservative. But I tended to be a little more cynical about that part of Anglo-Texas, if you will, and just because it astounded me that it existed. Even though, it's not like I had never left Eagle Pass, I'd traveled, but I was always in awe. I'd go to a place like Houston or San Antonio or Dallas, and it was like, wow.
College changes all of us, but I think the Latino experience is somewhat different because, we are placed in an environment that isn't home and it isn't comfortable as it might have been back where we're from. How was that for you? It was difficult to find your place, if you will, in a place like UT where it's largely going to be Anglo?
It was difficult then. And I can tell you that as well moved around as I am now. I'm 48 years old, and I've been and seen a lot of different things. It's still somewhat odd sometimes coming from a ranch to that. And I remember not really knowing, and we talked about this off mic, that I had this different idea about what Hispanic meant for some other people. Like for me, I grew up, I'm a Mexican national. And so I spoke Spanish, I still do most of the time. When I get nervous, I have an accent. And, it was, you weren't white enough. Although I'll tell you, it was weird because I was a Mexican national. For a lot of Anglo Texas, you get a pass. Like there's something different about you as opposed to, somebody from Dallas that's Hispanic. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It just, you were able to move a little more fluidly in that part of Anglo Texas. And mind you, when I got there, I tended to hang with more people from the border because I felt comfortable. I tended to hang with more Mexican nationals because that was my comfort zone. And I tended to have a dim view of Latinos or Hispanics that could not identify with that experience or didn't speak Spanish. And to me, that was just I didn't know those existed.
Guys like me.
Yeah. Like I didn't know. Yeah. And now I look back and I think, imagine, look, and I don't know how it was for you, Jason, but I can, trying to put a little empathy is, as hard as it was for me seeing that, I felt comfortable in my Spanish speaking world, if you will. I can't imagine for somebody coming from a place where maybe they would have spoken Spanish if it hadn't been for the pressure of their friends at school and or the teachers, because they're so far away from Mexico and or the border. And then they get to a place like Baylor or a place like UT or SMU, and you could go one of two ways. Like you could become more assimilated or anglicized or not. And it could have gone that way for me. It just didn't, right?
Did you experience racism at all because of your heritage?
I did. There's one thing that I remember, and it was I had a girlfriend at the time. She was at Texas Tech, and so I was driving from Austin to Lubbock. And I can't remember the name of the town, but it's somewhere between Austin and Lubbock, and it's closer to Austin than it is Lubbock. It's probably just a little west of the hill country, and I can't remember. I'll remember 11 o'clock tonight when I remember everything. And I remember getting off to get gasoline, and it was one of these old-timey gas stations where somebody comes out and puts the gas for you. And there's an old guy behind the counter, and I went up to ask him if he had a map because I wanted to make sure I was on the right road. This was before Google Maps and all that. And so he looked at me and he just stared through me, right? And I thought maybe he didn't hear because he was older, so I raised my voice a little bit, and he just staring right through me, and I didn't understand why I wasn't answering. So a lady comes in and starts talking to him, and he answers her just perfectly. So the guy that had been pumping the gas walks in, and I guess he sees me kind of in a quandary, and he says, "Oh, don't take it personally. He doesn't like Spanish fellas very well." And so I didn't know what to do with that. My first instinct was to tell him, "Well, I'm not Spanish," but it was one of those things, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was just the oddest thing. And I know I'd probably been subjected to racism. I remember there was a guy, I was at a party at UT, and some guy said, "What kind of name is Poncho?" And I said, "Well, that's a nickname for anybody named Alfonso." I said, "There's if your name is Robert, they might call you Bobby or Bob or Rob. Well, if your name is Alfonso, that's a nickname." I said, kind of like, and the guy's name happened to be Richard. I said, it's kind of like, if you're Richard, you're a dick.
I hope he found that as humorous as we did.
He probably didn't. We were both pretty drunk.
One of the misconceptions I think that Anglos often have about our experience as Latinos is that there is no racism. I mean, and clearly, I don't think that we face the same kinds of racism that our friends in the African-American community face. But I do think there is some soft bigotry that exists because of who we are. And you talk about that story, and I have 10 of those as well. What about expectations? I mean, you get on the campus like UT, then you go to the law school. And I remember always feeling that when people looked at me, I'm at UT Law or wherever, oh, he must have checked the box. That's why he's here, right?
Yeah. You had to be better. You had to be, that wasn't necessarily a good thing for me because I was already, rubbed to a fine point being competitive. And then I started to feel that creep of, well, shit, man, like I've got to be, honed finer and be quicker on the draw and faster and more ready. And it was, and I went to law school in St. Mary's. And so my experience was the class was a lot more diverse than probably UT, I would say. And so again, I was somewhat sheltered because, I'd come from UT, obviously had been a big shell shock, but I came back into this world where San Antonio is, one of the most Hispanic cities in the world. But even when you start leaving some of these confines of these areas in San Antonio, you start seeing, a different San Antonio that exists. That shock comes back like, well, wait a minute, we're not in Kansas anymore. It's a little different. But to your point is it's always there. There's always something there that you may not be able to put your finger on it right away, but there's an expectation, and even in, we're not allowed to make the same mistakes that others make. We don't have the same, I can't imagine, when I guess we'll talk about this in a minute. I could not imagine there's not facing up to how things are, as good as one might be at trying to put space between them and their problems. At some point, it seems to me that, at least in my experience and my upbringing and my cultural upbringing is, you gotta put your face there. Like that's you. One of the things in the political world, and we've seen a lot in the last 4 years, is people, even when the truth is staring them right in the face, there seems to be this ambiguous way of dealing with it. We saw the culmination of that a couple of days ago, but I see that for us, the margin of, and it's a good thing that the margin is slim. We should be held to a standard as human beings, as culturally, whatever, to the truth. And I'm not saying that other cultures are less likely to, or more likely to not tell the truth or not. It just seems that there seems to be a reward from putting off the inevitable truth for some people. And for us, we don't really have that.
Yeah, you brought it up in your first statement that we always have to be better. I remember in my experience in college and in law school, we're held to a higher standard if we're going to be accepted. So the baseline is we have to be excellent, but in order to achieve as a Latino in Texas, you have to be better than excellent.
You got to remember there's still pockets of the state where I remember when I first run started in 2011, and you remember our primaries seemed to go on forever because we were doing that deal with the map. It was driving us nuts. And so it stretched from 2011 to 2012. And I remember going to Valverde County and starting a campaign. I remember somebody telling me there, hey, you're going to do real good. You're going to get the Mexican vote. And I'm like, well, what's that? Like where I'm from, there's just the vote. And it highlighted just how different, Maverick County is to Valverde County. Valverde County was the last school district in Texas, might have been in the US, but I know for sure in Texas, to desegregate, after Brown in 1974. And you're talking about almost 20 years after Brown v. Board. And so if you look historically, and you look no farther than, our colleague and my compadre, Terry Canales, the influence of Anglo-Texas stopped at certain points because of the fear of the Mexican army crossing to what was then, the border in the Nueces River. And there was always that dispute between Mexico and the U.S. about where the border was, whether it was the Rio Grande or the Nueces. And you look at the large landholders and ranches, at some point it becomes anglicized, and at some point it's Hispanicized, meaning, the land grants are still there. They've broken up over families, but there was a more Hispanic influence in these parts of Texas, and it's still pervasive. You still see it. Mm. So to that point is just traveling sometimes from one county to the next changed completely the Hispanic experience, because in Maverick County, my good friend, and now, I was telling you about the neighborhood, one of the guys from the neighborhood, he's a county judge, right? And his dad was the first Hispanic county judge in Maverick County in 1968. And so that didn't come to Valverde County until much later. And some of these counties west that are part of my district, I think Brewster County elected their first Hispanic county judge while I was in the legislature. So think about that. And, you're familiar with Brewster County. That's where the park is, and your family's from out there. And so put that in perspective. I mean, there's places where they're probably never going to sniff a Hispanic sheriff or a Hispanic county judge. It's not going to happen. Mm. But it's changing. We had two successive Chinese American county judges out in West Texas, if you can believe that. When I took office, there was one in place. One was he was a doctor, or is a doctor, and then now the county judge, successful pharmacist and entrepreneur. And so it's changing. It's slow, but it's changing.
So let's fast forward quickly to wife and kids. So you leave law school, you're practicing law now. It's time to raise a family. I mean, it's time to do something with your life.
Yeah, I was pushing 30 and I met a wonderful person who's now my wife. And we, it's a funny story is my grandmother and grandfather sold her parents the half block that they have their home on. And so we've known each other for forever. We just didn't know each other. And we have that shared history. And so, she grew up in Mexico, went to schools in Mexico, University in Mexico. And so we got married back in 2002. In fact, our anniversary is on the 19th. This is going to be the first anniversary in 10 years that I haven't been campaigning or.
Wow.
So one year before this, I had kidney stones. And so we were in the emergency room. I've managed to ruin a whole bunch of anniversaries either because I had kidney stones or I was in the legislature and I hope not to ruin this one, but we've got 3 kids. We got our oldest is at UT. She wanted to go there because her dad went there, and she's living a much different experience at UT. But I could tell you that, and I remember this. My middle child and both of them. I remember sending them off to school, and I remember going to school. I didn't speak a lick of English, and I remember how hard it was. And I remember my first friend, and he's still one of my best friends, and he lives out in LA. He's in the movie business, and he spoke Spanish. I remember him putting his arm around me and telling me it was going to be okay. And then I was okay. And so I remember we dropped off my middle child at a school in San Antonio, St. Anthony's, when we were living in San Antonio. She didn't speak a lick of English. I remember we dropped her off, and I remember walking back to the car, and I sat in the car and I just bawled because aside from the usual bawling when you drop off your kids, I'm thinking, how's it going to go for her? Like, she's sitting there and it's a world of English and she doesn't speak a lick of it or understand it. And it just suddenly transported me back to that kid in pre-kinder that didn't know a lick of English. And it was something to make that connection and that bridge.
Kids changes.
Yeah, man. And I went through a period after I got married where, I was obviously working my ass off to try to build my practice and make money and move us ahead, economically. And it took a lot of my time, but things were better. They were easier. I remember we had a smaller house, and I was laughing at my wife. We spent a lot more time together just because there was nowhere to go, right? Like, you're here, you're there. There's not as many rooms, and the bigger your place gets, the emptier it gets. And I'm grateful for all that. As I sit here today in front of you and we talk about this, I laugh a lot of this stuff because you have to be grateful even for the things that you don't have. And I used to believe I was grateful, and maybe I was at some point. And then I became grateful, or what I would call fall grateful, somewhat like, yeah, I'm glad I got this, but why don't I have that? Or why isn't it like that? And, for an alcoholic and an addict, that's like one of the worst, and that kind of, and I don't know, it's kind of like the chicken or the egg. You don't know what comes first. Is it your ego stomping on you? Is it your lack of patience? Growing up, you probably know this, is that lack of patience was what? Initiative, right?
Right.
But at some point,
perseverance.
Yeah, but at some point it's not. It's just a simple lack of patience. And this as well as I do. Sometimes in the legislature, it's rewarded. These tantrums that we might throw about X, Y, and Z, while they may show some initiative or perseverance or determination, really it was nothing more than lack of patience. I want what I want, and I want it now.
Yeah, people like us aren't generally known for our patience.
No.
So when you were raising a family and practicing, were you headed towards the legislature, or was that something that came later?
It's funny is when I got married, the year that I got married is in 2002, we had, I mentioned Tracy King, Tracy's was the first political campaign that I ever worked on a little bit and contributed money to. I still have the letter that Tracy sent me thanking me for my $500 check, right? And so Tracy ran against a guy that they redistricted Tracy's seat, and he was now having to run in Maverick County, which was basically the bellwether for the district now. And he lost. He'd been in the legislature since 96 to that point, so he lost in 2002. And it was tough because he ran against a candidate that was funded very, very well, and he lost. And it was a guy from Eagle Pass who only served one session because he ended up getting indicted by the feds for some dealings that he had with his dad. But that aside, I began to see the possibility, like, wow, that seems like something that's pretty good and or looks interesting.
So you weren't politically motivated in college or before. This is something that you saw as a young family man, that there was a way to serve and something that was interesting to you. So many people ask the question, why did you run for office, right?
Well, and before that, predating that, and I was always very vocal or sticking my hat in, if you will, or my hat
on
in
the school board too.
Yeah, and that was before that. And so after this is when I got more interested in actually being a candidate. But it wasn't for lack of being vocal and before that, I had worked on my friend David Salcedo was a county judge. He was the youngest elected official in Texas back in 1991. He won a county commissioner seat. He was 19. And I remember working on that. He's a year ahead of me in school. And so he was at Texas with me and both graduated Eagle Pass High School. He graduated a year before me. I remember working on his campaign. And I mean, that's as grassroots as you can get, just going out, poll watching, knocking on doors, helping put up signs. So it wasn't hard for me, because of my relationship with Judge Salcedo. His dad had been the county judge. That was something, and I'm always thankful for that, for better or worse, because the conversations that we would have growing up, like David's one of these guys that can tell you, how many votes Gary Morrow lost his gubernatorial race by. Like, that's how steeped he is in Texas politics. His family has been helping Democrats win in Maverick County and around Maverick County for 50 years and so or more. That kind of fired and fueled me there. And then now getting to know Tracy at that point, you kind of started to see it on another level. And so a few years after that is when I ran my first race as school board. I was fortunate enough I didn't have an opponent. They cleared the way for me, which was great. Yeah. And, and then I resigned from the school board because I was spending a lot more time away traveling because of work. So I come back and I run for my seat again and I lose. And so I'll never forget, I was eating a barbacoa taco with who became my campaign manager and then chief of staff, my first session in the legislature. And we were looking at the district, and it was a Sunday morning. We're eating barbacoa, and he says, "Man, you on the school board?" He's like, "They redrew the seat and we started looking at it." And he's like, "Why don't you run? You can win. You're coming from the most populous, you can win the primary. It's a Democrat seat." And and then the only question was whether or not the guy that was in the seat, who had held it for a long time, P. Gallego, who ended up running for Congress and winning. He's now the president at Sol Ross. He's a friend. And I'll never forget, another friend, Mark Rodriguez, calls me on, I don't know if he called me or sent me a text. I think he may have called me. It was on my birthday, September 1st. And he says, we'd been talking about the 800-pound gorilla in the district, and that was Pete, whether he was going to run or not. He says, "Hey, the 800-pound gorilla is running for Congress. The seat's open." And so there was probably at least 15 people that were interested in the seat. And I took some advice from a political mentor of mine, Robert Gonzalez, who's still around there in Maverick County. He told me, "Why don't you call people and gauge their interest as candidates and tell them that you're interested?" And it really helped, because I think a lot of people especially when there's an open seat, everybody's like, "Oh, they're scurrying around to run." And I don't know if that was the case in yours, whether it was an open seat or not.
No, it was an open seat, but because Will Hartnett had left. And so but we had a number of candidates in that primary.
Yeah. And so it was the same thing. There was probably like at least 10 people there, and people that were more well-known in political circles. And I was somewhat, I knew people because of my law practice, but I probably didn't know as many Austin and or Capital people as some of the other people that might have been on the list, including some county judges from other parts of the district. That's how I started, like talking to them, gauging their interest. And in the end, there was just 3 of us, 2 guys from Del Rio, one who's a mayor of Del Rio, and then a county judge, and then myself. And I actually won without a runoff, which was pretty cool.
That's great.
And that was the last time I had an opponent. And I used to tell people, like, the only person that beats Poncho is Poncho. And it actually became true.
You learned the hard way.
Yeah.
So you're on your way to the ledge. And when we get there, we're classmates. We start at the same time. That first year is proverbially drinking from a fire hose. What were your feelings about it? When you got there, what did you think? You think this is great, or this is not what I expected?
Well, what's funny is, remember, we were the largest class since like 1970. There was 43 of us. Yeah, I mean, I'm staring over here to your left, my right, the picture of us on the House floor. And we were the largest class, and there was, I want to say 14 Democrats and almost 26, 27 Republicans, right? And, I tell people there's all kinds in the ledge, but generally it's dominated by a lot of type A's. And so everybody there is, big man on campus, right? And I started, it's like anything else. You show up like the first day of 2 days or first day on the track. You're trying to measure yourself up with all the other alpha dogs and see what's what. And it was kind of like that. And I realized that one is there's a lot of talent in our class. There still is. And they still make up now what I believe to be the bulk of the more effective legislators in the House now. And I can say that without offending some of the older group or some of the younger ones. It's the way I see it, right? And I thought I measured up pretty well with everybody else. And I was just astounded at the different backgrounds. And, there's always that joke like, oh, how did I get here? Well, how did he get here? And there's some of that, right? But I think generally most people are good and decent and they have a story just like mine. And, it seemed, and if you remember, it was the session after the big Tea Party takeover, 2010. So a lot of our classmates were kind of breathing that fire, if you will. And I remember kind of watching bemusedly some of the conflicts within your caucus and your class of Republicans between that and the more mainline Republicans, if you will. And it didn't occur to me how much that clash would come to control the ebb and flow of what happened over the next, 3 or 4 sessions that we were involved in, right? But it did. And I thought my first session, it was like, wow. Like, I remember I was so excited. It was during our orientation. Charlie Guerin, and I just met Charlie, and I'm talking to Charlie Guerin outside remember we would gather down in the extension in that room, and we'd have these little breakout sessions, and I'm out there. And Kenny Armbrister comes walking with Governor Perry, right? I was more excited to meet Kenny Armbrister than I was Governor Perry. And I'll tell you why, because growing up, I would hear or read about Kenny Armbrister in the Express News doing that. Like in my mind, Kenny Armbrister was like the biggest senator in the world, right? And so it was like, here's Kenny Armbrister. He was the legislative liaison for the governor's office. And like,
the arm twister.
There you go. And here's Governor Perry. I was like, yeah. Kenny. Like, that was my reaction. And so it was that. And I'm sure for you it was the same way. It was kind of like this, wow, I'm here. Like,
it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. I always say it's like a kid in a candy store. If you like politics, you're steeped in it. And it's nothing but politics all the time.
24/7. And for me, it was that. And I think it was one of the parliamentarians, I'm sure it was bullshit, told me like that was Sam Johnson's desk that Lyndon Johnson used to play under, which I'm sure it wasn't. But it was nice to think that it could have been, right? But it was and is a fascinating place. And I can only imagine the ones that are going to get sworn in on Tuesday, and they already went through their orientation. They probably have all these ideas, like I'm going to do this or that. It's almost like fighting Mike Tyson. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, and you get punched in the mouth in the legislature.
Everything changes
a lot, and and it'll change everybody. It's just a question of what it does to you. What parts of you does it sharpen? What parts of you does it dull? And I admire men and women that are able to do it at a high level and not let it chip as much humanity away from them as it could. And you just never know, like, man to man, woman to woman on that floor, like what is it doing to who and why? And I don't think any of us come out of that experience without some sort of scar.
Well, your classmates voted you freshman of the year for your class. Tell me your best memory of that first session.
My best memory was I had a bill that would allow for colleges and universities that produce low number of graduates for a certain discipline. For instance, the more rural universities, like Sul Ross, for instance, they're not going to graduate as many chemistry majors in 1 year as the Higher Education Board had put in this criteria for them, and they weren't just going to do it. So what that would mean is you lose the program. Well, if you do that consistently, then at some point, Sul Ross is going to be nothing but a welding and rodeo school, and that's not good enough, right?
Right.
And so I had this as a standalone bill, and I got wind that Governor Perry would veto the bill. And so at the time, Kel Seliger, who's one of my senators, right, he was the chairman of the Higher Education Committee in the Senate. And they were doing the sunset bill, right? So I go talk to Kel. He says, look, why don't you get the bill on or get your bill on as an amendment to this bill, and I'll defend it in the Senate. And we'll see if the governor will veto the sunset bill. And so I got a lot of, that was a great moment because I was able to it was a mix of rural Republicans, myself, and then I got some Democrats interested in it. And we were able to get this amendment on, and it saved a lot of these universities' programs, their chemistry programs, their math programs, their more specialized engineering programs from getting cut for not, and I'm not trying to break my arm, patting myself on the back about the policy, but to me, what was awesome about it is how it happened. And then sure enough, Kel, who didn't know me from, Adam and is a Republican, but yet he's one of my senators. He and I share Loving County, which is the least populated county in the United States. And sure enough, he did what he said he was going to do, which was defend it, get it to the governor's desk, and the governor signed it. And for a kid from Webster Street, that shit was awesome.
Well, not only is it awesome, but what our listeners probably don't know is how hard it is to affect policy as a first-year member, right?
You're alluding to something extremely important is everybody has all these ideas, and they're good, generally speaking. And of course, your idea is the greatest idea in the world. And yet, when you start trying to convince and herd 149 Yahoos, and I say 149 because I would never call the speaker a Yahoo, but 149 Yahoos of how great your idea is, you're going to meet some resistance. And some of it's stated and some of it's not, but it's there. And so nothing can prepare you for the frustration of having a good idea flushed. And you don't even know why sometimes. And it's hard to understand it. And your first session, maybe you can deal with it. And I did, but after a while, you start getting that why can't I do this? I've got more experience. I've got more credibility with members. I've got more seniority. Why can't I get this across the line? And the answer is that's the way the system's set up. And more often than not, some of these good ideas end up on the floor because that's just, dead on the floor.
Most freshmen are told when they come in the door, sit down and shut up and learn. But that was never your style. It wasn't mine either. You passed bills. You got things done as a freshman. And I think that's a testament really to your ability as a legislator. How are you different than others that were in that role?
One of the things is when you're in the minority, and I'm grateful for a lot of my colleagues on, both Republicans and Democrats, in particular Democrats that already had been there, guys like, I remember Craig Island. He was a real deal, guys like Anchia, another guy that I was like, wow, man, these guys are doing it at a real high level. And they were good at allowing guys like me to sort of get in the game. And when you're in the minority, you're not counting on math to carry the day. You guys could, and I'm not saying that you guys weren't as astute or playing the game any different, but a lot of the guys on your side were basically aren't learning anything because they weren't needed for anything more than to press the button, yes or no, right? But for us, it was different. We had to be in we had to do things a little different because we couldn't count on math. We had to whip, for a lot of things that we wanted to do, we obviously needed Republican votes, and you couldn't count on your own caucus to carry you through. And I think it's good for parties to be in the minority because it teaches you how to be a different or more effective legislator. And I'm not saying that a Democrat would always be more proficient at it. It's just, it happens more often.
And you have to work harder.
You do. And it's, I used to be really good at calling the next play and running it. That was my nature. But at some point, whether it was a question of my alcoholism getting away from me, my drinking getting away from me, my grief getting away from me, my addiction now getting away from me, I could not turn the page. I couldn't move to the next play. I just could not understand why I couldn't get these things done. And I knew my rational brain should have been able to tell me it's not set up that way, dude, relax. But I just couldn't anymore.
Well, you have to, like you say, wrangle 149 other cats, and then the Senate, and then the governor. So there's always a challenge. But you were effective. You really marshaled your skills and rose through the ranks quickly. By the third session, you're now a chairman, right? And your fourth session, you were a chairman.
Yeah, my second and third, I was a vice chair of Homeland Security, and I later became a chair of that same committee in my fourth session. And, I was grateful for that. I was grateful that the leadership saw something in me to put me in those positions. And I tried to be as responsible as I could, discharging that duty. You think about it, and we talked about this off mic, is, and I've said this before, there's three different constituencies. And there's the one at home. There are the people that advocate for different interests, lobbyists, advocacy groups, whatever you want to call them. And then your fellow legislators. And so you're walking in between. And at some point, those things, they intersect, but a lot of times they diverge, right? And it's which one to put in the proper perspective or the proper place in terms of how you're dealing with it. That's a very important facet of becoming effective. And there were points in my career where I could really see the whole field. After my first session, you know how it is. Things start to slow down and you can see things. And then it gets away from you because you want to marshal this ability outside of what you can control. And think about it, Jason, there's very little of that process that you can actually control. The sooner you come to that realization, the happier you're going to be and the better you're going to be at it, I think. And I mean, I could see your point, talking about there was, in your circumstances, because you were one of the few Hispanic Republicans, it was you, Larry and JM. And so there was a point to try to make a point to us, meaning Hispanic Democrats, like these guys got to succeed, right? Which is good. You and I would have this discussion a lot because I don't mind having discussions about and disagreements about policy. I want to have them with you. There's no reason why you and I shouldn't be on the opposite sides of a debate, or people shouldn't expect us to be on the same side of the debate just because we have a lot of vowels in our last name. And I think that we were talking earlier about what somebody who's not Hispanic looking on from the outside in on an experience. Well, they might not understand that it's okay for you and I to disagree about a policy position, how to get there. Like, we want to get to the same spot, but how are we going to get there? And I welcome that. As Texas changes, that's where we should be. Put aside some of the crazy stuff that we see. There's a lot of room in that minefield to walk through on cogent, mature ideas between Hispanic legislators that may not be from the same party or cut from the same cloth socially or economically, right?
So the world's watching you be successful. The world sees that you're rising through the ranks. You're an effective legislator. You're doing well at home. Your legal practice is strong. You're being advanced. What's happening behind that?
It is costing me a great deal personally. And it all starts from, in my case, I went from being somebody, what I call a normie, like somebody who could drink a little bit and then move on, to somebody that was starting to abuse alcohol.
When did that start?
I think I've always been a problem drinker in the sense that I couldn't stay away from it. And it's not that I was drinking every day. It's just, to me, the problem drinker is when it gets in the way. And I could look over the course of my life and say, well, it got in the way this time. It caused me to do this, or it caused me not to do this. But now, probably my third session in, second session in, like it overcame me. And with that, the drugs were right there. And I fell into this pattern of picking myself up and then knocking myself down. And so it's a pretty, it sounds cliche, but it's a pretty vicious cycle. And in the end, it's not my fault that I have this disease, but I'm responsible. Like, there's no doubt that the consequences that stem from it, they're on me. They always were. And, alcoholics and addicts, we're a sorry ass lot when it comes to, we want self-pity. We want to shift the blame somewhere else. And for me, all these, from the outside looking in, all these things are going great, but I can't manage myself. It would cost.
How did you hide it? I didn't see it.
Because I just didn't want anybody to see it. I was telling you, I'd go to a dinner, have a few drinks, and then I'd go home. And on the way home, I'd stop at the liquor store and I'd get fucked up. I get smashed. And I'd take opportunities to basically hide myself away on the ranch and liquor myself up, use drugs, and stay away from the responsibilities that I had. And what suffered was my home life. There's no, I spent a lot of time away. And even when I was there, I was absent. You know what I mean? I was so consumed by what I needed to do in the legislature. And even when you're not in the throes of an addiction or alcoholism, the legislature takes a lot of time. Like, it is mindless of the time that it causes or costs you, if you will. my ego was just pile driving me into the ground. Like this notion that no matter what I had, I was grateful, in parentheses, but I wasn't, I wanted, why isn't it like this? Or why isn't it like that? And that's, my obsessive compulsive nature and wanting things to be a certain way, wanting to control things that are completely out of my control. I know I'm not alone in that, but it happened to affect me in a way that it may not have affected somebody else.
Alcoholism is not uncommon in the legislature.
No, it's not.
Drugs, a little less common.
Probably, yeah.
Where did that start? And,
I think growing up, I'd managed to stay away from drugs pretty much up until my late 20s, which is kind of weird. And then I experimented a little bit with cocaine, and then I got married and I started raising a family, and I just kind of stayed away from it. It just didn't seem to have a place in my life. Drinking did. It never stopped having a place in my life. And then as I got into the legislature, it ramped itself up for no other reason that I had left myself wide open because the amount of drinking I was doing and the poor judgment that I had in managing myself and my emotions, it left me open to it. I mean, I can't say that every hard drinker or alcoholic is going to go to cocaine or pills or whatever. But I mean, does it really matter if, your drinking's putting you in the ground the same way? In the end, it's, it just happened to lead me there. And I'm not justifying it. I mean, I'm an alcoholic and an addict. I make this comment. I was in an AA meeting one day, and a guy made a very compelling argument as to why I can't even begin to imagine myself taking a drink because I don't have any margin for error. But he said, a cucumber can become a pickle, but a pickle can never become a cucumber. It is what it is. Like I crossed the Rubicon on that. There's no going back. I'm not set up to be a social drinker. I'm not set up to sit here and have a couple of pops with you and then walk away. I'm not going to do that because I know where it ends. And today, I want to say I'm 450 something days sober. I've got a little calculator on my phone. I'll check when we get off. And it's simple, but it's not easy.
Would you have stopped had you not gotten caught?
I don't think so. I think that the problem with alcoholics and addicts, and my problem in particular, is you try like you want to, but you can't. And there seems to be, and the perception of alcoholism and addiction has changed such that there's no such thing as willpower. I may have willpower and not being able to eat another chocolate or, eat 3 dozen tamales, which I won't like to, but I can stop myself from that. I can exert willpower, but in this I can't, and I couldn't, and I tried. You have to hit a bottom and you have to want to get better. And I wanted to get better. I just didn't know how. And think about this how would I have done it? I mean, now I know how, right? I can look back and say, this is what you should have done, dummy. People were willing to help you. People close to me and around me, they could see me spiraling. They didn't know exactly what it was, but there was something off, right? But I didn't know, how can I go to rehab? What's that going to do? What do you start thinking? The self-preservation. What's it going to do to my family life? What's it going to do to my all-important political career? What's it going to do to my practice? And every response to that is, you don't want to deal with the fallout. That's what, at least I was as an alcoholic and an addict. I was delaying the pain, so to speak. And in my mind, I was rubbing some dirt on it and getting back in there metaphorically. But the short of it is, and, my dad told me this, he's like, think of the odds of what happened and why, that envelope falling out of my pocket where it did and being found. He's like, there's some providence to that. And I believe that. As I sit here today, I believe there's something of in an alcoholic or an addict who's able to be sober today, there's something of a miracle in that. And I believe it started with that, is Providence did that because I needed to bottom out. And that was it. We were talking earlier about telling the truth, and it as an addict or an alcoholic or some other, you may have some other emotional disturbance that may cause you to say, what, I've got to deflect this. I've got to invent some crazy story about this. And it occurs to you. But I realized in the end, if I had done that, how do I walk into my house, a liar, an active alcoholic, an active addict, and then act like this is somebody else's problem or fault? And whether or not substances would have killed me at that point, I most certainly would have done something to myself because I couldn't have lived with myself. And it's not because I chose some politically expedient path. It's just, it was what it was, and it was time to deal with it. And I tell people, one of the things in the program is in the 12 step is you try to help and take the message to other addicts and alcoholics, and you take it to people who want it. There's a lot of people who may need it, but they have to want it. And I got to a point where I wanted to get better. And that envelope dropping out of my pocket was me wanting to get better. I mean, obviously it's like, well, did you have to do it that way? Like, well, yeah, I guess. I mean,
yeah, I think the newspapers, when they picked up the story, it seemed surreal, right? Because it had indicated a business card in the envelope or something like that. Like, people are like, well, how did that happen?
Well, because you're not really thinking well as an. I mean, think about it. The hubris. There's a certain amount of balls, and I don't mean in a good way, that enters in or factors into the way you think. And I mean, I was at a point where I was pretty sick, and there were all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories about why I did it. In the end, it's the simplest explanation is what's true is it fell out of my pocket because it was supposed to.
Yeah.
And that's it. And believe me, between that date and the time I started to get, maybe that was September 6th, and I got clean and sober on October 14th. I went back and forth, like, how am I going to deal with this and what? And in the end, when I told my wife, this is what I'm going to do. And she said, yeah, she's like, that's the guy that I married. Like that guy, be that guy.
I remember, again, it was very public.
Yeah.
But you didn't shy away from it. I mean, I know that you were on Twitter and you were on elsewhere being very frank and open about that.
I had to, because again, now knowing what I know about recovery and the program, you look at the 12 steps, number one step, and really number one step, if you think about it in anything that you do in your life, is render yourself powerless. Like, give up, so to speak. To give up sometimes means to get control back over the things that you can control. And I didn't go to a meeting until a week after it became public. My cousin, who's now my sponsor, she took me to my first meeting, right? A week later. But intuitively, I realized that I needed to walk away, and the walk away or the walk back here was laying it out there, because it did two things. One is that day, because I knew it was coming, believe it or not, as scary as it was, I felt the freedom, because I was free. Like, I could start to see it, coming off me, so to speak. The hardest thing, obviously, was talking to my children that night. I was in California. I had to make my way back that day, and it was the longest day because I had to talk to my daughters, who were very upset. And it took a long time to get them back in my corner, so to speak. And you kid yourself as an alcoholic or an addict when you say, well, I'm not hurting anybody but myself. Well, that's bullshit. You're affecting people close to you, your friend. I mean, I had so many friends, like you and a lot of guys in the legislature, a lot of people from a lot of different places that they were worried and they cared about me, and it lifted me up. But I intuitively knew that this was the best thing. And if it meant that I wasn't going to be the state representative anymore, well, that was, the week before I already said I wasn't going to run. And I was already having like, well, maybe I should, it's just, yeah. But then I realized, like, no, man, I've got to step through this door all the way. And I'd always been really good at doing everything all the way. Like, I used to laugh, and I'd tell my compadre Terry, like, hey, man, if we're going to go into this wall, let's go in at 100 miles an hour, because either we're going to get on the other side or it's going to smash us up and it won't matter. And I needed to do that with this. I needed to be all in for my life. Like, I had to pick it. And it's not like, I went to a point, Jason, where I was so grief-stricken, and my grief isn't the reason I was an alcoholic or an addict. I mean, if it didn't help it, but it'd be shameful for me to say that was the only reason, because it would. And I know you lost your sister, and so you know what I'm talking about. Is it would dishonor her memory. It would dishonor my friend's memory that I lay this on them, because it's not like that. It didn't help me, and it pummeled me more than I was pummeling myself. But to say that it's all on that's a cop out, and that's not the case. I didn't care. I thought about it like, it's going to kill me, and I really didn't give a shit. And that's not like I wanted to die, but I just didn't care enough to change. And think about that is, I mean, I have a wonderful life, Jason. I really do. I'm grateful for so many things today, that even the things that I don't have, I'm glad. I'm glad I don't have, 4 or 5 days that I don't have the seat anymore. I'm glad. I'm grateful for it. It's somebody else's turn. I have to be grateful for that. I need to be, and I want to be. And as good as my life was then, you were talking about from the outside looking in, is that's how bad the disease is. It doesn't allow you to enjoy what your life really is. It robs you of that. And it was robbing me of that. And I feel like today I have a chance to live the life that I'm supposed to live. And think about it in the Latino and Hispanic culture, like, have another drink. It's not going to hurt you. A lot of people don't understand, that I don't, I go somewhere and they're like, hey, have a drink. Like, well, no. Like, come on, like one, like, no, man, like you can have one. I can't. And in our culture, that's kind of like, think about it.
It's almost a snub.
Yeah. Like, what kind of man are you? This kind of stuff. Well, I'm a man who doesn't drink. That's the man I am. And, in the legislature, I've come to find out a lot of people that are sober in the legislature, and, there's some support groups. I hope that, any member that might be struggling with that, whether they've been there a while or they're new, that they reach out. And to anyone who's at the sound of my voice today and this podcast, I tell them, if you want to talk about it, I'm there to talk about it. I know a little bit about it. And I think people underestimate, they're struggling with this, the ability to talk to another alcoholic or addict, because we understand. And it's a real personal program, but it's also, the group helps. And I'm reminded of a line from a Sting song. It's called All This Time, that, men go crazy in congregations. They only get better one by one. And that's kind of the way this thing is. And, that congregation for a while, I was a member of a 150 person congregation, and it can make you pretty crazy sometimes.
I want to stop there because I just think that what you've talked about, very personal, but it's also inspirational. It sounds like today you're happier than you might have been at the apex of your legislative career.
Yeah. And man, there was some good, I made very good friendships, and, I'm sitting here as a testament to one of them. And there was never going to be enough that I could do that would satisfy all these things that I felt, all these itches that I needed to scratch. And, whatever the future holds for me, I don't know. I just know today, this is what I'm doing today, and this is good. And I'm good with that. And if the good Lord gives me tomorrow, then I'll figure it out tomorrow. And I think people that don't understand the mindset or the program might say, well, it's kind of difficult, or, what about goals? Well, it's not that I don't have goals or I don't think about the future. It's just, if I don't take care of what I have to take care of today, what future am I going to have? And if I don't watch myself and figure out what it is that's bothering me. And, there was a point, in the last 450 days when the reality starts to set in that this is how your life's going to be, or this is how it is today, that I'm not going back to the legislature. I was going to miss the good on good, and I will. There'll be times where I will, but the truth is, somebody else needs to do it now. And whether they do it better or worse, I don't know, but I know it's not me. It's not me today. And I'm good with that. And I sit here and I see you're good with that too.
I miss it. I miss the legislature. I miss the times on the floor with my friends and making policy and doing things that served my state. But like you, I struggled, with the stress of it. I lost a lot during that time, not being at home, not being fulfilled in a lot of ways, because you give so much of yourself to that. And being at home and being uplifted by my friends and family, my wife, my children, has made me happier and made me more comfortable.
That speaks to me, because it just does. And because I'm living that experience now. And I, for the people that are about to be sworn in, which is for their first session, they're all wide-eyed and they believe that they're going to be on this wonderful trip. I knew I was never going to be a lifer there. I knew that one way or the other. I just knew that it wasn't going to be something, I had so many things in mind that, and the funny thing is, all these things I wanted to do, my alcoholism and addiction were stymieing them. I wasn't able to move forward. And more importantly, I wasn't able to move forward as a person, and I feel like I had a lot more room to grow, to be more mature. And I'm still pretty immature, for 48, but I'm trying today. I'm trying to channel it, and one of the biggest things about trying to be, and I'm not talking about being this, and no offense to your beard, which is fantastic, by the way, it's not like I'm trying to be this bearded, mature guy. It's just, I want to resist the urge to be less tolerant whether I agree or not, you need to move on. And it's hard, man. Think about this, is we came from a point where our opinion mattered on a lot of things, and whether it mattered or not, people were actively soliciting it. And then we begin to believe that whether they solicited it or not, we should lay it on them. Right. And here comes big boy. Like, whether you want it or not, this is what I think. And it's hard to shift that gear. It's hard to not have an opinion because you'll have it, but it's hard to just say, you know what, I'm good. And think about now, like in the times that we live, there's so many things to be critical of or to comment on, especially after the last few days. And I mean, I have, a lot of things to say about, for instance, how the election went. And, believe it or not, I believe, and I was excited to see, and this is going to sound sort of weird, I was excited to see even the shift in these counties, because it meant people were paying attention. It means that they're going to pay attention to us and say, you know what? I used to make this joke that, in Maverick County, you would shake a tree, and if there were 14 voters in it, 18 would fall out and vote Democrat, right? Well, that's not the case, right? And it speaks to this idea that we are different, that there's something different about Latinos living in Harris County as opposed to Hidalgo County or Maverick County or Webb County. I really believe that even though the Democrats did not take the House, that the state's more competitive now. These districts up here in your neck of the woods, they're more competitive.
Unquestionably.
And so what it tells Democrats is you got some work to do to cover that distance, but the distance is a lot narrower. And some of these guys that retook their seats, they need to abide by that. If they're that in tune with what their constituents want, their constituents told them something.
Right.
And they should listen to that. And I'd voted for Republicans. I'd voted for Bush and probably a couple other Republicans that I voted for. And so I wasn't allergic to Republicans or voting for Republicans. And I thought about, well, what is my political bent Republican? I wasn't sure. And so I started asking myself questions about certain things. And I remember at the time, voter ID had just come in vogue the session before. And I asked some people around, like, I don't believe in that. Is there room for me to split on that? And there wasn't. And this, I mean, they'd ask you to toe the party line on a lot of things that are probably not congruent with what's fair,
right?
Especially to our community. And, the funny thing is things like redistricting and voter ID, for a lot of people in our community, that doesn't move the needle. They feel like, well, I can go vote. I don't, they don't see the minutia in why maybe it is hurtful to our community, right? And we couldn't, as Democrats, we couldn't find that issue that would really stimulate people, because redistricting, that's a snoozer, man. Voter ID, it wasn't moving the needle. No matter how eloquent or how hard we fought that on the floor, or how good we were at pointing out how petty and or useless or not supported by evidence other than anecdotes it didn't matter. And I think those things now, what we saw in this last election, should teach these groups that want to come in and court voters, whether it's in Dallas County or Hidalgo County. Well, what is it that, why can't I be talked to like a suburban soccer mom?
Right.
Right. Why can't they split me up in that group? Like, there's suburban soccer mom and there's suburban woman that works, in the tech field. There's that kind of rifle shot appeal to Anglos. But for us, it's a cannon blast with grape shot. I take that, right? And I want that. Like I'm okay with, and I used to tell people, look, if more people vote and I'm not the state rep, that's okay. I mean, put your policies on the line, put your ideas on the line, test them. And I challenge my colleagues in the next session, Republicans and Democrats alike, to lay that on the line. Let go of this idea that somehow people voting is a bad thing. Let's get back to appealing to these voters with our ideas and see if they work. See if it's something, it may be that this idea of voter ID appeals to, and think about this, for rank and file people in Maverick County, they kind of scratch their head when you say, having an ID to vote is a bad thing. There's a lot of rationales to why that is, but try to explain it to them. It doesn't make any sense. And it's not a good policy. We know it's not based in anything that's necessary. You make the argument, it's not based in anything that's necessary to keep voting more sacred or sacrosanct. It's not. But the converse of that is true. Will make me understand why it matters one way or the other. And we just couldn't do a good job of that.
Well, the world is certainly changing. We should save some of this conversation for a part 2 that we'll have in a few weeks after the new president takes office, and we can talk a little bit about Latino politics and what it means in Texas. Poncho, thank you so much for your time today and for your story. We appreciate you, and that is all we have today on Our Story from the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation. I'm Jason Villalba signing off. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing from you next time. Goodbye.
The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation would like to thank you for joining us today on Our Story. You can find more information about the foundation at www.txhpf.org, on Facebook on the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation page, or on Twitter @TexHPF. Please join us next week on Our Story, a podcast dedicated to the voices of Texas Hispanics.